Today I'm going to be showing you how to make the Serena tie top. This video tutorial has been a long time in the making because I've worked so hard on this pattern and I'm so excited for you all to make your own finally. This video tutorial works in conjunction with the sewing pattern itself, which comes with instructions. If you want to take a further look at that, you will find the link to the sewing pattern in the description box below. You can find more information about stuff like sizing, fabric requirements, and see all my lovely testers wearing their own Serena tie tops. So I also want to cover the difficulty level for the sewing pattern. I think it's suitable for confident beginners, which are sewists who have some basics under their belt, so things like making a basic top, you may have made just a basic pair of trousers, and obviously you understand how to use all the features of your sewing machine. If you've never completed a sewing project before and you're feeling super confident, then obviously go right ahead, that's absolutely fine. But I do just think it may help if you have some basics under your belt before starting this one. So this video tutorial and the instructions itself will cover basically everything else you need to know. But of course, message me if you have any questions. You can message me via my Etsy shop, Instagram, email, any social media platform, and I will always get back to you. So the next video is going to be showing you how to make continuous bias binding. If you know how to do this already, or you have decided to use store-bought bias binding, you can skip right through this and go straight into the method of making the Serena tie top.
Cut a single layer of fabric into a 50 x 50 centimetre square or 19.6 inches by 19.6 inches square. Cut the square diagonally to make two triangles. With the right sides together, sew the two triangles together along the straight edges with a 1 centimetre or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Press the seams open and place the fabric so that the wrong side is facing you. On the wrong side of your fabric, use a ruler to draw parallel lines 4 centimetres or 1.6 inches apart across the fabric, going along the bias, which is the long edges of the parallelogram. Turn your fabric so the right side is facing you and bring the two short edges together to form a tube. As you can see, the drawn lines are matching up perfectly. Pull on your fabric so that the lines are offset by one line. Pin the right sides of the short edges together and stitch with a 1 centimetre or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Press the seams open and make sure that your lines match up accordingly. Starting at one end of the tube, carefully cut along the marked lines following the spiral. You'll then end up with one long continuous bias strip. Make sure that you're only cutting through one layer of fabric at a time. To press your bias binding, fold the 4 centimetre or 1.6 inch wide bias binding in half, wrong sides together. This is so that you can find the centre of the strip. Unfold your bias binding and fold each raw edge to the centre of the strip, wrong sides together. You may end up with more bias binding than you need for this project, but it is a great opportunity to build your stash for future makes. Alternatively though, you can reduce the size of the fabric square next time to make just the amount that you need. If you want to reduce the time it takes to press your bias binding, you can use a bias binding maker, which I'm showing you on the screen now. I'll pop the link to where I got mine in the description box below. So starting with our left front bodice, I'm just using a water-soluble fabric pen to mark either side of my tuck. You can use tailor's chalk for this, but I prefer water-soluble pen. I feel like it's more accurate. I bought my fabric pen from Amazon and I think the brand is called Hemline, which I will link in the description below. I've started with my left front bodice, and as you can see, I'm pulling the pattern piece down slightly so I can make those markings clearly. I'm now applying the same step to the hem of the front bodice and marking again either side of each tuck. Now we need to apply the same step to the right bodice. I'd just like to mention I'm applying the markings to the right side of the fabric. As we're going to be using the pattern piece on the wrong side now to make the markings, you'll need to mark each side of the tuck on the wrong side of the paper so that then you can use it to mark on the right side of the fabric. So this is how your front bodices should be looking, and now we need to apply the same step again to the back bodice. Starting on the left side, I'm marking again each side of each tuck, and then I'm going to flip the pattern piece over in a minute and do the same on the right side of the back bodice. When you're drawing in the markings on the wrong side of the paper, it can be a bit confusing where each side of the tuck is because of the overlapping of the paper, but just make sure you're making those markings in the right position, as this is a crucial step. Your front and back bodices may look a little bit different to mine if you're a size 18 or above, as I've added extra tucks to accommodate the extra fabric so that you still get the same silhouette. So once you've finished marking your tucks onto your back bodice, we're going to start with the left front bodice, as now we need to press the tucks in. The first marking on your tuck represents the fold line, while the second marking indicates the placement line for each tuck. You'll need to be aware which way you're folding your tuck. So for instance, for the left front bodice, which we're doing now, we'll need to fold the tuck towards the right. I'm now applying the same step to the bottom of the tuck at the hemline, using the first marking as the fold line while using the second marking as the placement line. I'm now pulling on both those markings and it creates a nice fold down my front bodice. Now you want to get this fold line as straight as possible, as it should be parallel to the centre front. Some of my testers did suggest making a marking point on the placement line of the tuck by just poking through the pattern and making a small dot with your water-soluble pen, and then you could just draw in a line with a ruler to make sure you're getting that fold line extra straight. But if your fabric's well behaved or you're more of a confident, experienced sewist, then you don't need to do that. So continue to fold in each tuck until you complete the whole left bodice, trying to get to those fold lines as straight as possible. Avoid pressing your folds or your fabric with pins already inserted in them, as this can cause holes in your fabric, which you really don't want. So press the fabric and then insert the pin afterwards. Now we're going to apply the same step to your right bodice, except this time your tucks will be folded towards the left. So once you've pressed all your tucks, this is how your left and right front bodice should look from the right side of your fabric. And now again, we need to apply the same steps to the back bodice. So on the left side of your bodice, the tucks will be folded toward the left, and on the right side of your bodice, back bodice, the tucks need to be folded towards the right. Measuring from the hem of the front bodices, we'll need to make a mark 16 centimeters or 6.2 inches from the hem of the bodice. This is to make a mark of where we should stop our stitch line. The marking should be placed on the inner fold of each tuck. Where I'm marking using the water-soluble pen is where the stitch line should go, on the inner crease of each tuck. For those of you that are using a D-cut bodice or D-cut pattern, you'll notice that the front bodice features a curved hem. This is to accommodate the additional bust fullness. So follow the same method and mark along each tuck on the inner fold line 16 centimeters or 6.2 inches. Apply the same step to your right front bodice. Now it's time to reposition your pins on that inner fold line of each tuck, as this is where your stitch line is going to go. Some people get a bit confused at this point and start stitching down the pleats on the outer folded edge, which is what we don't want. We want the 3D effect, so that inner fold line so that the pleats almost stand up on their own at the moment. That's what we want. So starting at the neckline or shoulder or top of the bodice and then stopping at that marked point we made with our pen earlier. This process of stitching on the inner fold of each tuck needs to be applied to both front bodices and the back bodice. So you'll see in the video now where I've placed my pins. It's right on that crease line or inner fold of each tuck. So the fabric effectively is on the fold, and you're going to be starting from the top of the bodice and then finishing at that marked point we made at the 16 centimetre point or 6.2 inch point. As you can see, my tuck isn't laying flat. It has almost a 3D effect at the moment and it's standing up. That's why you need to make sure you've done it on the inner fold and not the outer fold. So repeat this process for all the tucks on the front and back bodices, and it should look a little like this once you've finished. And this is what your bodices should look like from the right side of the fabric. Now I'm just cutting any loose threads just so that they don't get in the way later on. So now you'll want to press the fabric beyond the stitch lines, smoothing out all the fold lines and allowing the fabric to naturally shape itself. I'm probably going to get a few comments on this, and technically no, I am not meant to be ironing on this table, but I don't normally play by the rules and I just think it looks a lot better for demonstration purposes rather than be going back and forth to an ironing board. So before we stay stitch the neckline, I just like to trim any excess fabric along the neckline and shoulders. So now we're going to make a stay stitch around the neckline, shoulder and armhole. A stay stitch is a standard stitch that's just normally sewn through a single layer of fabric, and it will prevent the distortion of curves during this construction process, as some people tend to stretch out their armholes or necklines as they move the fabric about. This is also going to help us with keeping our tucks in the correct direction, as you'll need to take a look at the instructions and make sure they are all laying in the correct direction before you do your stay stitch. Place the front and back bodices right sides together and sew the side and shoulder seams with a 1 centimetre 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Make sure to press the seams really well, and then you can overlock the raw edges. If you don't own an overlocker or a serger, I do explain some other seam finish alternatives you can use in the instructions booklet. Next, fold each centre front edge towards the wrong side of the bodice by 0.5 centimetres or 0.2 inches. Press and then fold again by another 0.5 centimetres or 0.2 inches. You'll want to edge stitch both centre fronts with a 0.3 centimetre or 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Now we're going to be attaching your bias binding to the armhole on your bodice. So open up the folded bias binding and place the raw edge of the binding along the raw edge of the armhole with the right sides together, starting at the bodice side seam. Make sure the bias binding goes beyond the side seam by 1 centimetre or 3/8 of an inch, as we'll need to overlap the ends and sew them together. Attach the bias binding all the way around the armhole using a 1 centimetre or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Once you reach the end, you'll then connect the two ends of your bias binding. Place the right sides of your bias binding together and stitch as close to the side seam of the bodice as possible. Trim off the excess bias binding and press the seams well. Fold the bias binding to the wrong side of the bodice, making sure the bias binding is folded by 1 centimetre or 3/8 of an inch to conceal the raw edge. You'll need to stitch around the armhole again on the wrong side of the bodice, stitching as close to the folded edge of the binding as possible. A tip for those that are more on the beginner side of sewing, I have found these sewing clips keep the bias binding positioned so much better than pins, so if you want some more help with bias binding, I really recommend buying some. Once you finish stitching around the armhole for a second time, you'll need to apply this whole method to the second armhole. Now we need to attach the bias binding to the neckline. So repeating the same process that we used for the armhole, leave an extra 1 centimetre or 3/8 of an inch of bias binding at both the beginning and end of the neckline. Attaching the raw edge of the bias binding to the raw edge of the neckline. Stitch with a 1 centimetre or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance and press the seams well. Fold the excess 1 centimetre, 3/8 of an inch of bias binding under the second layer to neatly conceal the end. Either use sewing clips or pins to keep the bias binding positioned. Fold the remaining bias binding to the wrong side of the bodice and clip in place like we did for the armhole. The bias binding is obviously used as a finishing method, but in this case it's more of a decorative element as well, so it should be visible from the inside and the outside of the garment. So the green fabric you see in the video is called a sewing pig, and I've just folded it a few times, and it helps you and makes it easier to start awkward seams like the beginning of bias binding at necklines, as sometimes your machine just doesn't want to feed the fabric through, whereas this just helps the seam get going. I normally fold the sewing pig fabric a few times so it's the same thickness as what I'm sewing, but it's such a good tip and I cannot stop using it. Now it's time to finish the hem. So fold the hem towards the wrong side of the bodice by 0.5 centimetres or 0.2 inches, press, and then fold again by another 0.5 centimetres or 0.2 inches. Stitch with a 0.3 centimetres or 1/8 of an inch seam allowance from the folded edge, or basically just as close to the folded edge as possible. For those who have used a thicker fabric, more on the medium side, I do recommend cutting your ties on the bias as it will make them hang a lot better, as you can see in the video I've added. To construct the front ties, fold each end of the tie to the wrong side of the fabric by 1 centimetre or 3/8 of an inch and press. Next, fold both long edges of the front tie inwards by 1 centimetre or 3/8 of an inch with the wrong sides together and press. Fold the front tie in half and press. To connect the two folded edges, create an edge stitch with a 0.3 centimetres or 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Repeat the above steps for all 6 front ties. This is also another great occasion to be using your sewing pig, as it can be quite difficult to get the stitch started on your ties. So finally it's time to attach the front ties to your bodice. So the first set of front ties should be positioned 3.5 centimetres or 1.4 inches from the top neckline. Then I normally recommend that your second set of ties should be positioned at your bust apex, which is the highest point of your bust. Your third set of ties can be positioned wherever you feel most comfortable. I placed my third set of ties in line with the end of the tuck seams. I really hope you enjoyed this video tutorial. Let me know if you have any questions, and of course the link to the pattern is in the description box below.